Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Show. I am host Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Gabriel Crouse. Gabriel, how are you doing, sir?
I feel charming. It's alarming how charming I feel. I watched Anger Management last night, and I just got that song ringing in my head as I sort of, with great fury, with great anger, look at the regulations of the Command Council. But anyway, I'm good.
And also, welcome to Mr. Michael Morris, joining us, of course, from happy Cape Town. Michael, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I wouldn't class myself either as alarmed or charming, but but that's a pretty good balance, I think.
It's just a song. It's an aspiration rather than.
I was amused and very jealous of something you told me just before the show, Michael, which is that you haven't had load shedding for how long?
I would say, here in our suburb for at least a year. Certainly for the past couple of spells of load shedding, it's passed us by. So draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, must be nice. Anyway. Before we get into the meat of it, I just want to say that we have a glorious thing happen, which is, of course, that South Africa's soccer team, Bafana Bafana, has won a qualifying World Cup game against Ethiopia 1-0. Now, Bafana Bafana is, of all of our national teams with the big sports, probably the most disappointing. And so I think if they win a game, then maybe things are turning around. Who knows? Anyway,
and the poor Ethiopians, they were doing so well in 2019 and the beginning of 2020, and since then it's been war and plague, and now lost to Bafana Bafana.
No, exactly. That's the real salt in the wound there.
Yeah.
Please, before we go into the news of today, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, and if you are listening to us on audio only, please leave us reviews. Really appreciate that. Cool. So, not too much news at the moment going on, but probably the most important story is that it is the end of the term of our Chief Justice, Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng, who is stepping down from his role, I think, at the end of this week. I think that's on Friday also. He finished his term on Monday, the beginning of this week. When he was first chosen by President Jacob Zuma, there was a lot of concern that Mogoeng Mogoeng would simply be a rubber stamp on the will of President Zuma, that he would be a malevolent force who would pretty much finish off the independence of the judiciary. I know the DA was very concerned by him, as were a lot of other members of civil society, political parties and such. But it turned out that the worst fears did not come to pass. Mogoeng Mogoeng very importantly ruled against Zuma on an Nkandla matter, and he was praised for this by acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, who said, "The people of SA will not forget his judgment in the Nkandla matter, his secret ballot judgment in regard to the vote of no confidence in Parliament, and his SARS judgment on racism and many others. It has been said that the Chief Justice's judgment in the Nkandla matter proved a turning point on accountability and the fight against corruption in this country." Not sure if I agree with Mr. Zondo there, but whatever. And the DA's chief whip, Natasha Mazzoni, said she gave a sort of muted praise for him, saying, his tenure had been marred with controversy, but he was deserving of a farewell. Parliament would make its mind up soon and hold a proper farewell to him as Chief Justice. So, Gabriel, let me start with you. What do you make of our Chief Justice's run? And before we get into the question of who could replace him or who would be good to replace him, do you think he was a friend to liberty overall, or was he much more of a mixed bag?
Yeah, so I think just to go back to one of the issues in terms of what's happening on Friday, part of the thought was to have a parliamentary ceremony to celebrate his tenure and wish him well off. And that has been somewhat of a standard practice. On this occasion, Parliament seems to be reluctant to do so. I think that there are some sort of we're out of business and coronavirus questions, but some of it is also clearly an expression of dissatisfaction with Zondo's tenure. And I think Mogoeng Mogoeng's tenure. And I think that is in part because he gave the ANC some stick. And on that front, he must be credited. It was not always easy. It's not always the case that the Concourt has done so, I think, forthrightly and fully correctly. But I suppose we take what we can get. My main concern with Mogoeng Mogoeng is brought out by a series of speeches that he gave that people have sort of quite deliberately looked past, in which he quoted Lord Marquis, the vice-chancellor or viceroy, of Africa under the British colonial empire, who went up and down the continent in the early 1800s and reported back to the British Parliament that Africa was Eden, that it was a wonderful place full of freedom and culture and prosperity of material wealth and very proud people. And the only chance that the Brits would stand of dominating Africa would be by an education and military system that degraded and humiliated people. And as a result of the implementation of Lord Marquis' strategies, you saw the emergence of inequality, of crime, of bad attitudes to women, and so on and so forth. Mogoeng didn't just make this speech once. He made it several times. He gave different versions, which were more and more kind of race nationalist, this grand utopian idea that Africa was Eden. Then Jan van Riebeeck came, then the Brits came, then it became life became nasty, brutish, and short. And the implied solution is to return back to where we were. In short, to make Africa great again. Now, the temptation for thinking that our past, whatever our is defined by, was perfect it's great. There's a great seductive appeal there wherever you come from. I think it's always something to be treated with some measure of kind of playful respect. Okay, have your holiday, pretend it was all glorious, but also very serious caution, especially when it's coming from a Chief Justice, and especially when it's coming at the time that it did, which was the emergence of the expropriation without compensation debate. This seemed very directly connected with the thought that if you only take away property rights and only make sure that there are no commercial white farmers or very few of them, then everything is going to be okay. Now, as Daily Friend listeners will know, I'm sure this was all BS. Mogoeng's source was a meme, which was made up by a bunch of college kids. Lord Marquis had never been to Africa. No one had traversed Africa as he said he had. He actually was from India. He never made a speech of the kind about India either. It completely doesn't correlate with the facts on the ground in Africa at the time. If anything, the Brits were exerting a great positive influence by the abolition of slavery, which cost them great blood and treasure to administer. A lot of the worst things that the Brits did really came at the end of the 1800s. And of course, that's why Sol Plaatje, the co-founder of the ANC, recalled the great halcyon days of Victorian Britain and said, you know, you guys had high ideals and you actually put some backbone into making it real. And now you're just kowtowing before the nationalist forces, particularly of the Free State at the time, who are looking to abandon Cape franchise for non-white voters and the like. Anyway, Mogoeng Mogoeng never recanted. He never apologized. And I think that there's something telling about the fact that he was never asked to apologize. And that's that when race comes into the picture, it's like a magnet approaching a computer. It just sort of turns off the circuits. And this is a great problem. So it's like he's a fully reasonable guy himself. He's somewhat charismatic, maybe speaks a little bit more than you'd like a justice to do. But he's challenged on his attitudes to Israel and Palestine. He's challenged on his attitudes to vaccines. There's sympathetic interpretations in which it all makes sense. There's hostile interpretations in which, he needs to be challenged, and then the challenge is forthcoming. But in this case, where he unambiguously spread fake news based on false information as a source with a broader narrative that is counterproductive to our project of non-racialism, he was left unchallenged. And I think there's a soft bigotry of low expectations that's demonstrated there from the broader South African public, and especially its sort of top flight journalists, those who've had access to Mogoeng Mogoeng. I recall to conclude that the only person I've seen conduct a long form interview with Mogoeng Mogoeng was my peer Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, one of this country's most excitable race nationalists, someone who says that, you know, the common law is racist. And
can I just say, Gabriel, that excitable is a wonderful adjective. So, Michael, what do you make of Mogoeng Mogoeng's tenure as our Chief Justice? And if you were to appoint someone, I'm not saying that, you know, we're going to get this person, but if you were to appoint someone from anywhere in South Africa, who would you put as the Chief Justice of our courts?
Who would I put? Goodness, that's something I hadn't really thought of. But perhaps in the course of chatting, I'll think of a name. It's very interesting, actually. I kind of thought a little bit about the story before we started, and the one thing that I thought was worth touching on is precisely the thing that Gabriel has addressed. Lord Macaulay's egregiously misquoted element in several speeches by Mogoeng, one of which, of course, was, as Gabriel points out, nobody's challenged this. One of those speeches was, in fact, as I recall, to a prize-winning or a prize-giving dinner hosted by the South African National Editors Forum, which makes it all the more striking. I suppose Mogoeng is a bit like the curate's egg, good in parts. And I'm not sure if I had to remind myself actually of the origin of this wonderful expression, but it was a Punch cartoon of 1895. Depicting a meek curate who, given a stale egg at the bishop's table, assures his host that parts of it are excellent. and I think, yeah. So here we have, you know, a judge. I mean, my feeling is his personal views on Israel and on the risk of devilish vaccines would probably have been better left unsaid. Judges do have opinions, but there's a reason why the bench should be seen to be scrupulously disinterested and not to dabble in these sorts of things. It's arguable, but I do think I agree with Gabriel that the most revealing episode, in a way, apart from his judgments, and there, you know, one acknowledges the good ones as well as some of the flawed ones, but to me, the use of that false quote is particularly revealing, because what it seems to show is a jurist who's essentially swayed by his own prejudices and thus dissuaded from double checking his sources. It's really as simple as that, and it's a kind of carelessness that should not actually be forgivable in any judge. And it says a lot, as Gabriel has pointed out, about the rest of our society, that he hasn't actually been challenged on this, and he hasn't felt obliged, even though it has been written about, he hasn't felt obliged to clarify this or retract it publicly. So, yeah. As for a replacement, I still haven't really come up with a name. I'm afraid, Nick. Yeah, I'd need to give that some more thought, I think.
I'll field that if quickly.
Go ahead.
If I may. So the acting Supreme Court judge or justice Mlambo, I think, has served well as an acting justice on the Concord bench. Of the candidates that are actually in the final five, my sense from conversations I've had with legal eagles is that they're kind of hoping for him because he's been pretty good. No one in the final five seems to be firmly of the conviction that non-racialism means non-racialism. We're severely limited in that regard. And of course, you know, everyone's favorite almost made it, David Unterhalter, is also a proponent of race-based affirmative action. So I think that if you want to look for a candidate that has a real shot, you really have to look quite wide beyond the scope of plausible candidates. I sometimes think it would be interesting to recall someone who has previously served as a judge. I remember having a conversation with Albie Sachs, former Concord Justice, over a decade ago. I was sort of a kid, in which he discussed the costs and benefits of so many of our early justices stepping down early, sort of trying to follow the Mandela pattern of showing that you don't hold on to power as long as you can. But I think there's still some petrol in the tank for some of those people, and no one really thinks to say, hey, you know what, you stepped down, that was cool, why didn't you come back?
Yeah.
I just want to say, as a brief tangent, I'm actually amazed by the continuing widespreadness, I guess, of the complete fabricated version of history that a lot of race nationalists cling to. And the meme which you referenced that Mogoeng Mogoeng fell for, I see stuff like that all the time on social media, and it's actually crazy how much purchase they seem to have kind of outside of our institutions, with a lot of ideologues. And that is yet another reason why I think in our episode yesterday, we stressed the importance of teaching actual history so that people don't fall for garbage. But anyway.
Yeah, that's the thing. The tragedy there is, in a way, that if you, even as Michael says, you should be double checking your sources before you make a speech several times. But even absent that, you should have the background knowledge to just realize this is crazy.
Yeah.
Definitely. All right, let us move on to our next story for today, and that is a story about localization. So anyone who kind of follows political science stuff will find that tariffs are, I think, and Gabriel may have some slightly conflicting views on this, but generally speaking, bad economics, but good politics. They are pretty popular with people almost always, and but at the same time, they often cause economic problems. And we're seeing an interesting example of this, where in order to protect local chicken farmers, the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition is looking at increasing the tariffs on imported chicken into the country. Now, for a lot of South Africans, especially the very poor, the only protein they really ever have a chance of getting regular access to is chicken, because it's the cheapest. And there are fears that the increases in tariffs on chicken imports could push up the price of chicken in South Africa by about 20%, which is quite a lot. I guess proponents would say that local supply will increase because the industry is protected here, and eventually that might bring the price down. But I don't know. Gabriel, what do you make of this? Do you think this is good policy, bad policy, or terrible policy?
I'm ruining my thing. No, this is terrible policy. It goes alongside the scrap metal interventions by Patel, which have been devastating to local industry, the now new ban on import of cement, which is going to be terrible for the construction industry. Here's the caveat, and this is why I just ruined my bookshelf behind here. Here we have Jong Dae Park, South Korea's ambassador to South Africa, writing a weighty book about how South Korea went from being a place poorer than Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and Congo when he was a child, to being the 8th or 9th largest economy in the world. No one goes hungry, no one dies for want of a bit of medicine, and the schools really work. It's amazing what they've achieved there. They're order of magnitude wealthier than we are. So one of the things that he points out is that the first 30 years of South Korea's sort of post-colonial, post-World War II history, post-Civil War history, is about tariffs. Tariffs are a huge debating point. They're a huge political flashpoint. And they use tariffs and they use them effectively. So it's sort of the exception that proves the rule. You can think of a little bit of it like trying to get a fire going. You might want to shield the wind in the beginning. Eventually, once the bonfire is going, more wind means more burn. That's what trade is. It's just an exchange of energy, and it's great. You might think that in the beginning you want to sort of husband your fire. And he says this is why it worked here, and this is why it won't work when it doesn't work. we had a test, operate, test, execute strategy. You try a thing out. If it doesn't work, you scrap it. If something like it is being tried, you don't do that either. So you don't bang your head against the same wall 17 times in a row with minor variations. You figure out this is not working and you completely change tack. And South Korea's form of changing leadership was often assassination. I think 3 of their leaders were assassinated in that 30-year period. People were not patient. They didn't wait around to figure out whether the fire pool in Nkandla is going to be paid for by us or them. They were hasty. And that's an imperfect system.
Yeah, I would prefer fewer assassinations, I must say.
Me too. They replaced it with a vote, and then they've had changes of power quite frequently too, again on the same test, operate, test, exit systems. He said you can tell when it's ideological by the questions that the politicians ask and by the speeches that they make. If they're asking, is this going to work? When are we going to see whether this has worked by? What are the standards of evidence that are going to tell us we're on track? Then you're in the zone of maybe considering this extraordinary measure to try and husband the fire. But if they're just telling you bromides about the benefits of the poor and the terrors of colonial empires, then it's never going to work because they're not doing the real thing. And when do all of these tariffs, what does this all coincide with in terms of grand narrative? Cyril Ramaphosa going to the UN with his begging bowl saying Western democracies are evil, Africa is a victim, give us stuff for free. This is the sort of ideological climate in which these tariffs have been meted out. And it's set up ordinary businesses and especially unskilled workers for a situation in which there are less jobs and higher prices for basic goods, starting with chicken, but also going to if you want to build one extra room on your 4 wall because now you have to get locally made cement. It's a flippin' nightmare.
Michael, do you agree? Flippin' nightmare?
Yeah. And I think Gabriel makes a very good point. I've kind of made a little note for myself that the market isn't always best, but it's always far quicker and more dynamic in finding solutions. But the caveat, as Gabriel has pointed out, is where the state, in the case of South Korea's example, is capable of the kind of flexibility. And instead of relying on ideology to determine its course, I think your phrase was execute, test, execute. Was that right, Gabriel?
Test, operate. You have a theory, then you operate a little bit, then you test again.
Indeed. So that kind of indicates a capacity to be flexible, to change your mind, and so on. And one can understand. I mean, that's a very cogent argument, I think, in the early, or very good metaphor too. In the early stages of making a roaring fire, you do want to protect it and husband it along. But yes, I mean, as a general rule, I certainly think the states tend to be stubborn know-alls and slow to respond to reality. And that always comes at a cost to everyone. Whereas the market, for all its flaws now and then, and there are flaws in every market, does in fact incorporate the solution to those flaws in its very dynamism and localization. If it's applied in this very doctrinary sort of ideological way, it halts that very innovative and creative process, I think.
Indeed.
I just want to add one thing is we just pushed against this without even mentioning corruption. When you factor that in as well,
it's even worse. Yeah. No, and of course the other thing to just talk about is how if companies that were here were taxed almost nothing and didn't have a huge raft of regulations to deal with and had a police force that protected their property and their workers and all those things that are necessary, didn't have race-based laws to encourage investment, maybe tariffs wouldn't be such a big deal because maybe local business would pick up the slack. But I suspect what's going to happen is imports will be cut out and local business won't be able to pick up the slack because of the aforementioned strangling policies. And so all that will happen is poor people will pay more money for food, which is not great. Anyway, let us go forward onto our last topic for today, which is just kind of, I guess, about the state of unions in South Africa. So this is kind of 2 topics that we've mushed together as we are wont to do. And one of them is based off of a piece that a Daily Friend writer, Jonathan Katzenbergen, has put up on has written, and it's up on the Daily Friend today. If you go have a look, dailyfriend.co.za. But the other is just about the zombie that is SAA, which was revived like Frankenstein recently from the dead 3 weeks ago, and it seems like it's back to its normal fine form because the South African Cabin Crew Association is striking. It says that despite that, while management says that they met with all unions and that they agreed on how SAA was going to work moving forward and all the restructuring, the South African Cabin Crew Association says, and NUMSA as well, who are also involved in this, they're picketing outside of SAA's office in Kempton Park at the moment, saying that they have been subjected to, quote, slavery conditions because their wages were cut by more than 30%. And onto Jonathan's piece, which just talks about NUMSA as a whole, which is losing its ability to flex its muscles in the metal industry, which is of course the sort of center of its operations. It's currently engaged in a series of strikes in the steel and engineering areas, and one of the things that severely weakened its bargaining power is in the past, labor ministers could extend a negotiation, an agreement between, let's say, the big union and the big company to everyone in the sector. Which of course could really hurt the smaller players who sometimes can't afford to go along with the big wage increases. And a 6-year court case for the National Employees Association of South Africa managed to have this overturned in court and make it so that individual agreements now kind of have to be made. The minister can't just extend it to everyone. So I guess the point of all this is really that unions really seem, I mean, we've said this before, but they really seem out of touch with the economic situation. And the claim that Jonathan makes at the end of his piece is that they're kind of on the way out. And SAA, if I suspect that it won't be flying for too long. And in such a case, it'll be the union there will soon have no work rather than not well paid enough work. Michael, what do you make of all this?
I mean, I've often long felt that unions are probably a vital part of any free society. It's just a countervailing force. It's just a healthy thing to have workers' interests, advanced and turned into a kind of focus of attention by people who are devoted to doing that. But you often get the feeling that unions are kind of stuck in a different age. They've become almost old-fashioned. And that they're absent from actually finding solutions to the problems that go well beyond their particular locale of interest. It's the well-being of breadwinners. It's the success of the society to be what it wants to be. And in circumstances, as you say, with soaring unemployment, simply bludgeoning on in its really quite old-fashioned adversarial way, as if there are these resources which intransigent corporations or state employers are unwilling to share, is actually offering no solution at all to the greater project, and it runs counter to what most South Africans are actually hoping to achieve in this country.
Gabriel, in 60 seconds, your thoughts, sir.
By their fruits shall they be judged.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is so... I know a lot of people, I have a sort of small circle of friends, I should say, who were union reps and unionists in the 80s and 90s and legal teams and shop stewards and stuff. And the amazing thing is the ones who've made the most money for themselves have kind of stuck with the unions. And if you ask them to sort of demonstrate the successes of their careers, we'll just sort of give you a few stories about humiliating disses, zingers that they said like across the table to sub head honcho. And then you sort of ask about the workforce that they were representing, and it turns out it doesn't exist anymore. Those are the guys who make the big bucks. The guys, the rest have sort of left the unions and undergone these Damascus moments where they realize that the demands of the 1980s and the demands of the 2020s are not the same. And I suppose it's just amazing how slow the obvious facts of life can be to come to bear. But when that does happen, it's super cool. And more of that. I think that the trajectory that Jonathan Katzenellenbogen somewhat spells out is similar to what happened in the US, where the unions get stuck in an old-fashioned way of thinking. And it becomes quite difficult for competitive unions to emerge that are more practically oriented because they sort of all just get bundled in the same group. And so what happens is people de-unionize, and it turns out that for the most part works really well. And maybe that achieves a blank slate from which you can emerge with a kind of German Mittelstadt, really pragmatic situation where the unions are like, no, we don't want to raise. We didn't have profits. This will not be good. Research and development. This is the only way that we secure our future. You know, but yeah, I think you need a blank slate.
Yeah.
All right, that is all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening. We will be, of course, back tomorrow with another episode of the Daily Friend Show. We hope you enjoyed. Please review us. Please like us. Please subscribe to us. We'd really appreciate that. And, of course, most importantly, please support the Institute of Race Relations, which keeps us going. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Cheers.